is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Ring Rees-Mogg. Put your calls to Jacob Rees-Mogg now. 0345 6060 973. This is LBC.
Good morning. 9:04, Monday, November the 4th. Your opportunity to, as it says, ring Rees-Mogg. Jacob Rees-Mogg, currently Leader of the House of Commons, Conservative MP for North East Somerset. How many more days are you in that post, Mr Rees-Mogg?
Well, the government posts remain during the election. So the parliamentary post, being an MP, stops on Wednesday.
Right.
But I remain a minister until,
To those who say, when you allow that the Prime Minister achieved what was thought to be almost the impossible and actually got some accord for part of the European withdrawal and brought about an alliance that was thought impossible, why didn't he keep going with that rather than go for a general election? How do you respond?
Oh, the reason for that is the loss of the programme motion, which meant that the passage of the bill couldn't be assured, and therefore you may have ended up with something very different from what the Prime Minister had proposed. So could you get the Prime Minister's deal intact through Parliament? The question was, nobody knew. Could you have had all sorts of things attached to it that would have made the next stage of negotiations extremely difficult? That would have been highly probable. So there was an enormous political and indeed democratic risk in not going to the country to get a proper mandate, to get Brexit done and move on to the other issues that need to be tackled.
You talk of risk, though, but Mr Rees-Mogg, isn't this a risk? The general election a risk?
Yes, of course it is. It's always a balance of risk. And the problem was, once the Benn Act had gone through and had turned out to stop us leaving, and Parliament had set its face against the people, the question was, how did you best recover that? And I think the best way to restore Parliament's standing with the British people is to have a Parliament that will do what the British people want, and will do it properly and enthusiastically rather than begrudgingly and trying to trip up the process at every step. I think this has been a Remainer Parliament trying to implement a referendum result that was to leave and discovering as the process continued that actually they couldn't stomach it, and the new Parliament will be different.
Lastly, when you exit from this current House of Commons then, will there be a sense of relief? Will you be feeling a sense of relief that this so-called zombie parliament has finally come to an end?
This has not been a good parliament. This has not been a good period for the House of Commons in public estimation. And if you take polling on people's view of the House of Commons, it's as low as it's ever been.
Yes.
And I love the House of Commons. I think the history of it is so important. Our representative democracy is fundamental to our nation's history, and I can go on about going back to 1265 and how remarkable...
You don't go back that far, do you, Mr.
Not me personally.
You just feel like it's...
But how exciting our democracy is and how wonderful and powerful the House of Commons can be, but this one has just failed and therefore needs to be renewed.
Let's get the calls through. That's what it's about. Dan is in Hampstead. You're through to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Dan, go ahead. Good morning.
Good morning. The question I have is, with the current split in the country over Brexit, how certain are you that the Conservative Party can win the next general election with a clear majority as opposed to a hung parliament?
Dan, that is a very important question. I suppose my return would be, could it be more divided than the current House of Commons and less able to come to a decision? I hope that's unlikely. And we've got to put our message, and Boris Johnson is a brilliant campaigner. And there is a very clear choice for people, isn't there? Do you want your Prime Minister to be Boris Johnson, to deliver on the deal he's got and to get back to domestic issues? Or do you want your Prime Minister to be Jeremy Corbyn, to have 2 referendums next year, a negotiation which, once it's taken place, the Labour Party, having achieved a triumphal renegotiation of Boris Johnson's deal, will campaign against it in the referendum, followed by a Scottish referendum on independence, so willing to give up the whole country for the sake of getting a few extra votes from the SNP, or the stability Boris offers. So I think the country will back Boris, and therefore we won't be in the hung Parliament territory.
Just before I bring Dan back in, this is, of course, Boris Johnson, who vowed he would never send a letter to the European Union and he would die in a ditch. I'm delighted to say, as far as I know, his health is in perfect order and he's functioning as of today, unless you know differently. And so why should we believe what he says?
He had every intention. He was stopped from doing it by Parliament. The Benn Act was a disgrace. It was giving in our negotiating position to the European Union.
And it got through because of a Remainer House.
And it got through because of a Remainer House and because standing orders weren't applied in any normal way. Might be strong to say improperly, but they were applied in a way that had not previously been known. So the whole process was dubious. The House of Lords' contribution to this was extraordinary because it's the revising house, and it gave up on all its standing orders to treat a highly contentious bill as emergency legislation.
So Speaker Bercow got this wrong, Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Former Speaker Bercow.
Former Speaker Bercow got this wrong.
In my view, yes.
Quick response from you, Dan.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand where you're coming from. My main concern is I'm a unionist, I'm a Remainer, I'm a Liberal, but I don't want to see Labour in government. I think it'll be very damaging, potentially with the Scottish referendum on the cards.
Yeah.
I couldn't imagine another one of those. Boris, some of the Conservative policies are great, but I'm torn. I'm torn at the moment. I've yet to be.
What will it take? Lastly, Dan, what will win your vote, or indeed what might lose your vote?
I think potentially I'm going to have to vote strategically with regards to. I do not want to see a Labour government under this current leadership.
Let me thank you, Dan.
Dan, just to say, thank you for that. And I see that you're torn in many different ways on very strong principles. But in the end, to avoid a Labour government, we need a Conservative government. There isn't another choice. We've seen with the Remain coalition that the Lib Dems have already given up. They've already accepted that they cannot win. And therefore, voting for them is effectively a wasted vote, or a vote by default for Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, not if they bring in a sort of Remain alliance together.
No, it's unfortunately it's a losers Remain alliance, isn't it? It's of people who don't win many seats between them all. I think they've got 24 seats, so it's not a serious Remain alliance. It's an alliance of the people who lose elections.
But if it was on a Remain ticket, if you'll allow that possibly more than 20, that a fair percentage of people out in this country,
without including the Labour Party, it's a non-starter. And the Labour Party aren't even in the discussions.
All right, let's move to other matters. Dan, thank you. Sarah in Watingbury, which is in Kent. Go ahead, Sarah. Good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning, Sarah.
There are many conventions in the House of Commons, and there's been a few new ones introduced recently. Should John Bercow get a peerage, or should we change the convention for that too?
Look, I'm a great believer in conventions and in accepting that it's about the office rather than the individual. And the office of Speaker is one of the most important in our country, the one of very great distinction and antiquity. And we have to value that office. And therefore any decision that won't be made by me anyway, but will be made ultimately by the Prime Minister in relation to a peerage, needs to understand the importance of the office and rise above any here today, gone tomorrow disagreements with the one-time occupant of the role.
So does he get a peerage?
Well, it's not my decision.
No,
but in the broad terms, I think you need to look at the office rather than the individual. But I think it's always useful to have perspective. I don't think there's any urgent need to make a decision on this.
Okay, all right. Sarah, thank you. David in Paddington. David, you're through to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Go ahead.
Hello. With Nigel Farage fielding 600 candidates across the country, hasn't he murdered his own child? And isn't Brexit now dead? You know, and with the Liberals teaming up with everyone else, you've had it, haven't you?
And this very much in accord with the front page of one of the newspapers that Mr Farage could be the man who actually denied Brexit. David, stay on the line. Thank
you, David. Look, I've said on many previous occasions how much I admire Nigel Farage, and I think he has been in getting the country to vote leave. But I think he would be well advised to recognise that battle he won. He achieved what he wanted. We voted to leave. We've got a deal that gets us out of the European Union and will allow us to negotiate with the rest of the world. He should be really proud of his political career, and it'd be a great shame if he carries on fighting after he has already won to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. Now, actually, I think Brexit Party voters are by and large pretty wise people, and that they recognise that the only way to get Brexit done is to vote Conservative. It's a choice between the Conservatives and Jeremy Corbyn. And I understand why Nigel Farage would want to carry on campaigning, because he's been campaigning for the best part of 30 years. and it must be hard to retire from the field.
Well, he says
that's what he ought to do.
Well, he says it's not actually Brexit. This is what he told me around an hour ago. This is a Remainer Brexit.
Well, standing for principle can be difficult sometimes, but that's exactly what I'm doing. I will not stand idly by and see Brexit sold out by Boris Johnson, and I'm urging him to change direction. Let's have a proper Brexit, not a Remainers Brexit.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, how would you respond to that, a Remainers Brexit?
I would say to Nigel, on this occasion, you are wrong. It is a complete Brexit. There is an implementation period, but after the implementation period, we are out of the European Court of Justice. We make our own laws. The common fisheries policy is gone. The common agricultural policy is gone. EU trade policy has gone. We are no longer bound by any EU laws except those that we choose to keep. We are a free, independent nation state. This is hugely exciting. And unlike Mrs May's deal, the key difference is that without the Irish backstop, there is no mechanism for the EU to keep us in our clutches. And also, unlike Mrs May's deal, Boris Johnson has not committed to the closest possible alignment once we've left. He wants to treat the EU like other places around the world. And that's really important. This is a fundamental delivery on Brexit. We will be out. We will be making our own laws. That is the policy. And I'm afraid I think Nigel is, perhaps very understandably, because this has been his life's work, seeking out bogeymen where they don't in fact exist.
So the Brexit Party doesn't need to be doing what the Brexit Party is doing?
The Brexit Party should back the Conservative Party and defeat Jeremy Corbyn and deliver Brexit.
Have you told your sister, Annunziata, this?
I think... I mean, Annunziata...
You just suddenly, as you finished that, said, I know where he's going with this. Mr Rees-Mogg, have you spoken to Brexit candidate, or Brexit candidate, Annunziata Rees-Mogg?
Annunziata and I are the greatest friends, and I speak to her the whole time, and she knows my views, and I know hers.
Yes, but she is misguided. You love her, but she's misguided.
Annunziata's brilliant. I never criticise Annunziata. Whatever she does will be right, one way or another.
What, even to win as a Brexit candidate?
I'm not going to criticise Annunziata, come what may.
All right, OK. Lastly, coming back to Nigel Farage, the man who threw away Brexit, your former ERG colleague Steve Baker.
Well, Steve...
says that.
I think that says it all. Look...
He could then. He could be the man who throws away Brexit, Nigel Farage.
Every member of the European Research Group, which I used to chair, voted for Boris Johnson's deal. These are... the people who have lived and breathed European treaties, people like Bill Cash, who fundamentally understand this, better, dare I say, even than Nigel Farage, who have the detail at their fingertips, and they are willing to accept the deal that Boris Johnson has got. If the Brexit Party wants Brexit delivered, they should vote Conservative, and they should also avoid Jeremy Corbyn. This is the very, very clear choice.
Matthew, thank you, Mr. Rees-Mogg. Matthew's in Warrington. Go ahead, Matthew. Good morning.
Hello. Good morning. Hello, Jacob.
Hello, Matthew.
Warrington North, Labour stronghold. We voted to leave, I think it was 62%. Our Labour MP has done everything against that.
I'm sorry, you'll have to remind me who your MP is. This is Nick Ferrari speaking, by the way.
Helen Jones.
Helen Jones, thank you. Go ahead, Matthew. Yeah.
I would vote... Warrington South will vote Tory. Always, it's a swing seat. Warrington North is a Labour stronghold. I would vote Tory, but I know it's not going to happen. But I will vote Brexit Party because the Brexit Party's got more chance of getting in. So can't we... There needs to be some pact because otherwise Helen Jones is just going to get back into a seat and waste everyone's time again and go against the vote of the people.
Isn't this a cry from the heart, a cri de coeur, if I may, from Matthew here to people such as yourself to consider doing some kind of deal? He could see Warrington North going Brexit, i.e. going Brexit/Conservative.
Matthew, I see the logic of that and why you would be suggesting that. I actually think in this election, if we want Brexit done, we've just got to vote Conservative.
But you know that some people, it's almost visceral that they can't. You do appreciate that. Look, it's almost part of their upbringing. I doubt you'd ever vote communist.
No, of course I wouldn't.
Right, so some people, they cannot bring themselves, they can't countenance it. Mr. Rees-Mogg.
Do you know, I think to this extent politics has changed because you are now facing a reality where Labour MPs have completely failed their constituents.
But listen to Matthew's just said that.
That's right.
Matthew, you much as you dislike Helen Jones, and you don't mean anything against her personally, could you bring yourself to vote Conservative, Matthew?
If I thought Conservative would win Warrington North, I would vote for them all day. But hell would freeze over before the Tories got in Warrington North because it's such a strong Labour stronghold. You know, Doug Hoyle was the MP before Ellen, and Doug was a great bloke.
Yeah.
Yes. Doug Hoyle is an absolutely splendid man.
Yeah.
Yes.
He was great value.
He's charming, absolutely charming.
So Matthew is more tactical than of the...
I think Doug Hoyle's almost as conservative as I am, but that's another matter.
But so his isn't from the heart. His is tactically. He would say it's a wasted vote, Jacob Rees-Mogg.
I understand that. I think in this election, it just won't be a wasted vote. I think this election is different. Brexit has changed things and has changed tribal loyalties. If you look at polling and you listen to some of the expert pollsters, they are saying Brexit has changed things and people are now much more voting on Leave and Remain than they are voting on their traditional loyalties. So that's why I think we may get a surprise in Warrington North.
Well, thank you, Matthew. There was a surprise on LBC last week when my former colleague Nigel Farage, the Brexit Party leader, managed to get a call from Donald in Washington, and he suggested this. Of course, Donald Trump suggested this.
You're the President of the United States. I have great relationships with many of the leaders, including Boris. He's a fantastic man, and I think he's the exact right guy for the times, and I know that you and him will end up doing something that could be terrific. If you and he get together, it's, unstoppable force.
What about an unstoppable force, Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage? To you, Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Well, it seems that Nigel Farage doesn't want to do that. He wants to ask for something that he knows is impossible and seeks to...
What's he asking for?
Asking for Boris Johnson to get rid of this deal that he's just negotiated, which is wrong in all sorts of ways. It risks us losing Brexit altogether. It would get us back to confusion and delay. It's basically playing into the hands of Jeremy Corbyn. So Nigel needs to recognise that he has won. But there's nothing that can be done with Nigel if Nigel simply wants to oppose.
To David in Hampstead. David, you're on the radio. Your question, sir. Good morning.
Hello, good morning. Good morning, Mr. Rees-Mogg.
Morning, David.
I'd just like to ask, why are the Conservative Party in this election abandoning what is a traditional Conservative policy of tax cuts? I don't mean across the board. I mean to encourage business. I'm 27. I own a business. Boris Johnson, for example, spoke before the election of raising the income tax threshold. And in traditionally, the Conservative Party have always promoted that. And one of the ways they've encouraged enterprise and business growth is by cutting business taxes and all that associated with it. So I'm not sure why they've abandoned that, because if nothing else, it's a very popular policy amongst people who own and run businesses.
David, the manifesto hasn't yet been launched, so I wouldn't rule out the chances of tax cuts being in the manifesto, because the Tory party has always been the party of low taxation.
Is this including business rates or personal taxation?
It's all taxation. The Tory party is in favour of low taxation,
right,
and always has been.
Right. And you're aware of the impact of business rates on many...
very much so. Very much so.
I don't know about North East Somerset, but elsewhere in the country, I'm sure it is affects North East.
It's an issue in North East Somerset, it's an issue across the country, it's a particular issue in high streets. And the relationship between high street rates and warehouse rates. It's a clear issue. I don't know what will be in the manifesto, but the Conservative Party is the party of low taxation and always has been. And you know that between Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson, taxes will be lower under Boris Johnson. Jeremy Corbyn believes in high taxes as a good thing in themselves. He likes taking other people's money. And his expenditure plans are extraordinary. I mean, the amounts that would just be siphoned off from all of us.
Well, your party is to spend a lot of money as well, with police officers and extra money for the health service, extra money for education. I mean, where's it all coming from, Mr. Rees-Mogg?
It's completely proportionate to the growth in the size of the economy. That since 2010...
How much have you borrowed? What are we borrowing at the moment?
Well, it was 150 billion a year when we got elected. It's now down to 32 billion pounds a year. But if you think that's on a 2.1 trillion pound economy, so you're talking about borrowing about 1.5% of GDP. That's a perfectly reasonable level to be at. That's perfectly sustainable. And so the reason we can afford to spend more is because the economy has grown, 28% growth since 2010, and is likely to grow faster once we're free from the constraints of the European Union. So there are huge economic benefits coming our way. And that allows Conservative spending plans to be met and taxes to be reduced as well.
David, thank you. To Ben in Golders Green. Ben, you're on the radio. Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning,
Hi there,
Ben.
Jacob. How do you reconcile being a climate change denier with your very strong Catholic views, given what the Pope has said about climate change being the most important threat facing humanity and something that will risk the lives of billions of the poorest people on Earth?
I'm not a climate change denier, so the premise of your question falls.
Well, in 2017, I saw you gave several speeches with the Global Warming Policy Foundation, who are an institution who won't disclose their funding.
I've known Mr. Rees-Mogg for a number of years. I've never seen him look so... Are you absolutely certain of this? This is one of these difficult situations, Ben, when I've got nothing to go on here. But you're suggesting that Mr. Rees-Mogg did what, Ben?
Global Warming Policy Foundation.
He's known for denying man-made climate change and is affiliated with an institution that exists purely.
Ben, I think you're inventing all of this. Unfortunately, the global warming whatnot.
What? Just give us the name, and then I must move on. Ben, what is it you're saying? Give me the name of the organisation again, sir. If
the
you would.
Global Warming Policy Foundation.
I speak to lots of organisations. Certainly, I haven't made a number of speeches for them. I'm unaware of ever having spoken to them or having particularly heard of them. So I don't actually know what you're talking about, and I'm not sure you do either.
Ben, I know you've gone away muttering and angry, but Mr. Rees-Mogg is in a position of such importance in the country currently that there will be newspapers and others, and we are listening to this, that if he has misrepresented himself in any way, this won't go away, and Mr. Rees-Mogg knows that as well.
Look, if I've spoken to this random organisation lots of times, I would be very surprised. I'm not saying...
There's a suggestion you're on the payroll, by the way. I don't know if you picked that up as well. Yes.
Oh, no, I'm definitely not on the payroll. No, that...
You can...
That's just rubbish.
Okay. All right, Ben, we'll have a look at that, as I sense will others, and we'll move on to other matters. And indeed, pick up on a comment you made a moment ago. Martin in Cambridge, the idea of remaining. Your question regarding that. Martin.
Yeah. Morning, Nick. Morning,
Martin.
Basically, Leave always has to explain what's going to happen with Leave when we leave the European Union. What's going to happen with Remain? Because the Lisbon Treaty comes into full force in 2020 or 2022, and there are about 40 policy areas where our veto goes. So basically, the status quo has changed. How can Remainers say that the Leave side has to explain when they don't actually know the future themselves?
Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Well, Martin, I think you hit the nail on the head, actually. And it's interesting because I've discussed this with... MPs who backed Remain, who now think that we would be remaining in something very different, because even since we've become semi-detached, the EU has pushed ahead with its integrationist drive, and that the EU is setting a path to being, if it isn't already, a federal state, where the member states are like the states of the United States, and that we're getting out, I think, just in time. Otherwise, you would find the EU army coming along. All these things that have been talked about would be at risk if we were to remain at this late stage. And so I think you're absolutely right. We need to be out clearly, and we need to avoid having a future that is being a satellite, a colony, as Mr. Verhofstadt said, of the European Union.
Quick response from you, Martin, before we move on.
Yeah, I mean, I've got quite a good source in the European Union. My brother's a professor of history and international studies at John Hopkins University in Bologna, so he talks to these people all the time. And what the sense is that we would have no power if we went back in, because they would if they say, yeah, you can come back into the EU. But you would have to accept what we tell you. So, say they bring in the tax harmonisation, or they want to get hold of the City of London through financial services, we would have to accept everything they said. Because what they would come back with as an argument is, well, if you don't like it, leave.
Martin, I think you're absolutely right. I think that if we went back in at this stage, we would go back in as an humiliated nation. And in that status, we would have to take everything that they threw at us. We would simply not be in a position to defend our corner. And therefore, remaining now would be much, much worse than remaining would have been had the referendum gone the other way in 2016.
Martin, thank you. Grant, come to your question in just a moment. Since we last spoke, the first inquiry into the Grenfell tragedy has been released by the Judge Sir Martin Moorbook, in which certain recommendations, and highly critical of the command structure, the communications of the London Fire Brigade, not the personnel on the ground, but some of the command structures. There have been suggestions that in part the tragedy was caused by either racism or policies of class. Are these suggestions correct?
I don't think so. I think the tragedy came about because of the cladding, leading to the fire racing up the building, and then was compounded by the stay put policy. And it seems to me that is the tragedy of it, that the more one's read over the weekend about the report and about the chances of people surviving, if you just ignore what you're told and leave, you are so much safer. And I think if either of us were in a fire, whatever the fire brigade said, we would leave the burning building. It just seems the common sense thing to do, and it is such a tragedy that didn't happen, but I don't think it's anything to do with race or class. And indeed, I think it's rather sad to raise these types of points over a great tragedy. Nobody was...
Well, it's the Labour MP who's doing it. It's
nobody was
Emma Dent Code, the local MP.
But nobody...
It's racism or snobbery.
Nobody was evil in relation to this great tragedy, but people made mistakes. And humanity makes mistakes. And sometimes they have deeply tragic consequences. But it wasn't done because people had chips on their shoulder or they were bad people. They just got something terribly, terribly wrong.
In which case, can the Commissioner of the London Fire Brigade stay in post, Danny Cotton?
Well, I don't want to advise her personally on the choices that she should make, that she will read the report and she will come to a conclusion for herself. It's very easy for politicians to take potshots at people making very difficult decisions. Would you or I have made a different decision in those circumstances? But I think the one thing we can do is say how much we admire the individual firefighters. I mean, can you imagine the bravery you need to go into a completely smoke-filled staircase with breathing equipment that is running out of oxygen and saving that final person that you managed to save? Their heroism should not be ignored, undermined, forgotten because of mistakes made at a higher level. And the mistake had tragic consequences, but I don't think it was made by people because they were wicked. I think it was made by people because they thought they were doing the best.
If I can impose on you to stay for one final minute. Thank you, Mr. Rock. This question of Grant in Carrickfergus has been hanging on the line. Grant, if you could put your question quickly, I'd be jolly grateful. Go ahead, sir. Good morning.
Certainly. Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning, Grant.
Yes, good morning. If Northern Ireland is as British as Finchley and the Union of 1801 is precious, why is it that this Conservative government and consecutive Conservative governments betray the Unionist people at the last hurdle?
Well, I don't think we have. That Northern Ireland is, to my mind, as much a part of the United Kingdom as Somerset is.
Not within this deal, though.
Well, but Northern Ireland is the only part of our country that has a land border with the European Union.
So it's not the same as Somerset?
It's the same as part of the United Kingdom. But it has a land border that Somerset has with Gloucestershire, which we are sometimes very concerned about, but in normal circumstances isn't a problem. And you've got a peace process in Northern Ireland that is an issue on top of that. And you've got no Stormont Assembly operating. Now, the United Kingdom is one whole. It's a bit like the Trinity, that it is one, but it is of different parts. And the different parts have different faces to some extent, and they have their devolved powers, and those are different one from another. And Northern Ireland has its devolved powers that aren't working. But this decision was taken as a United Kingdom decision. Northern Ireland will be in the same customs territory as the rest of the United Kingdom. But there will be some special facilitations to ensure that there is no need for border controls between Northern Ireland and the Republic. But that doesn't mean that Northern Ireland doesn't remain just as much part of the United Kingdom as Somerset.
Grant, I'm grateful that I'm sorry I haven't got a follow-up because I have a final question. Jacob Rees-Mogg, you're well known that your late father was a senior newspaper editor. How do you react to the possibility that the Daily Telegraph Group could come under the control of Steve Bannon, one of the co-founders of Breitbart? Is Mr. Bannon a suitable press baron?
I'd rather put it the other way around. I think the Barclays have been absolutely fantastic owners of the Telegraph, have done a really good job in ensuring it remain
sales
high quality. But sales of all newspapers have gone down.
Well, the value, 655 million when they bought it in 2004. You and I, if we had it together, we could get it for 100 million now. Is that a great job, Mr. Rees-Mogg?
Well, newspapers have declined in value. But what's interesting is how well some newspapers are doing on their online editions, which is, I think, where it looks as the future of newspapers.
And Mr. Bannon as the proprietor?
I met Mr. Bannon once, which hugely overexcited the leftists who thought there was some great plot. He was an interesting man to meet. I think his view of conservatism would be rather red meat even for Telegraph readers.
Jacob Rees-Mogg appearing here on LBC. Good to see you. Thank you very much. Who knows when we shall meet again in these trying times.
We'll see if you have me back.
Indeed, we'll see. News on LBC is next.
Jacob Rees-Mogg has told LBC Nigel Farage is wrong to suggest the government's withdrawal deal with the EU is a Remainers Brexit. The leader of